All right, so just to kind of kick this off and get things started, you released your first novel when you were 19 years old. What is that like to be that young and to already have something that is that big? And also, where did the inspiration come to start on that at such a young age?
Wow, I could do a whole presentation based off those two questions. I mean, first of all, thank you to everyone for being here. This is my first time doing this convention, and I had an absolute blast, and I think most of you were in my signing line earlier, and you survived that, so thank you. It is also very exciting for me to be here today because this is the very first public appearance I have done since announcing my new book, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, which is coming out December 31st, and which also my sister Angela co-wrote a little part of it, and she was the inspiration for the character of Angela the herbalist. So we're all very excited about this book. What was the question again? No. What was it like to have something like that happen at 19? And of course, I self-published earlier than that. I was actually under 17 when my family and I self-published Aragon. And the reason I'm able to still remember that is because my parents had to co-sign the contract with Random House with me because I was still a minor when that happened. Honestly, when it happened, I did not really get how unusual that experience was. You know, the things that happen to you when you're a kid, when you're a teenager, there's part of our brain that just goes that, oh, well, this is normal. This is kind of what happens. This is the way life is supposed to be. And as I've gotten older and had some more experience and done other things, I've really, really been able to look back on this and go, wow, that was weird and unusual. And I understand now why these other fantasy authors who were 30 years older than me were looking at me cross-eyed at Comicon going, what is this kid? Why is he here? I would look at someone else the same way myself at this age. So it was very strange. But I was and I am incredibly grateful for, the response from you and readers like you all around the world to the books. Without that, none of this would have been possible. And that response has never changed. Even to this day, I'm still astounded by the feedback and the fact that the books are still popular. It's become a generational thing at this point, which tells me there's, I guess they're decent books. What was the second part of the question?
What was your kind of inspiration? Like, where did you draw from to get
Right. Well, I mean, like all of you guys probably, I'm a huge sci-fi fantasy fan. I read tons and tons of fantasy growing up, and just as much as science fiction. My mom was more the fantasy reader, my dad's more the science fiction reader, so his bookcases, yes, he had bookcases that were his. And they had Asimov and Clarke and Heinlein and, Philip Joseph Farmer and Herbert and Anne McCaffrey, some of her sci-fi, and all the classic sci-fi. And then my mom had Tolkien and Ursula Le Guin and Wrinkle in Time and all the fantasy classic stuff and The Hobbit and that. So David Eddings drew me into modern fantasy. I was like 8 or 9, and I was in a B. Dalton back when B. Dalton bookstores still existed. And I saw this copy of The Ruby Knight by David Eddings, and I had no idea what it was about, but the cover was a painting by Keith Parkinson, and it had this knight in full plate armor with a spear facing off of this scaly, dragon-like monster, and all I knew was this must be the coolest book that had ever been written. Because that cover was the coolest cover I had ever seen in my life. And I was with my grandfather, who is this elderly Italian gentleman. Basically, if you've ever seen The Godfather, that was my grandfather. His name was Maurizio Paolini, and he had a mustache, and he spoke with a heavy Italian accent, and he was a wonderful person to be around, but I'm just remembering the time he sent a pig's head to a man who wasn't paying his loans, so, anyway, I went to my grandfather who had taken me out, and I said, will you please get me this book? I have to have this book. So he bought me the book, and it was David Eddings who got me into fantasy, and then I was homeschooled, I didn't know anything about the world, and I was in my library looking at David Eddings on the shelf, and I didn't know any other fantasy authors. So I'm going, what am I going to read? What am I going to read? Because I've read now, however many Eddings books I'd read, it was like 20 of his books. And 2 shelves down at our very small local library, we went from E to F. And there was this really thick black book with a little green dragon on the cover. And it was called Magician by Raymond E. Feist. And the cover kind of scared me because it was kind of intimidating looking to me when I was a kid. But I said, okay, I'll give this book a shot. I don't have to finish it if I don't like it. Well, I loved it. And I read all of Feist. And then I was going, what do I read next? What do I read next? Well, a couple shelves down, there was this book called Mossflower by Brian Jakes. And that led me to all the Redwall series. And then on the other side of the shelf, there was there was Anne McCaffrey. That was a good one. Anne McCaffrey was good. And then there was Andre Norton. And then, it went on. Now, specifically, and I've spoken about this elsewhere, I was inspired by a book called Jeremy Thatcher Dragonhatcher by Bruce Coville, which is a great YA fantasy novel set in the real world about a young man who goes to an antique store, and I'm going to completely spoil the book for you now. He buys a little stone that ends up hatching a dragon. And I love that idea so much of a young man finding a dragon egg that I just sort of took that idea and ran with it. And the first time I ever met Bruce Coville, the author of Jeremy Thatcher Dragonhatcher, he was this close to being ready to hate me, I think, because I'd spoken about how his book had inspired Aragon. And you have to understand that Bruce Coville looks like a shorter version of Sean Connery from Indiana Jones. He has a white beard, and he has a voice like the voice of God. He does audiobooks. They literally cast him as the voice of God in the Old Testament in one recording, okay? And so he glowers at me with this amazing voice and this beard and everything, and he said something like, what do you have to say for yourself, young Paolini? And I just looked at him and I said, I love your book! And I never could have written my book without your book. Thank you. And then he kind of softened up, and then everything was good. I know I'm getting completely off topic here, but
go for it.
I actually got to meet Terry Pratchett at a convention a number of years ago. It was in Florida. It wasn't at the convention proper. It was after the main events, and my publicist or handler took me out to a nearby restaurant, and we saw Terry Pratchett over at a nearby table. And so me being all of 24 and stupid and brave, I marched over to his table, said, hi, Mr. Pratchett, I'm the author of Aragon, and I just wanted to come over and say, and before I could even finish, he looked at me and said, well, what do you want? And he looked really angry, like, he was scowling, and he said, well, what do you want? I went, well, I'm a big fan of yours. And he got this big smile, and he says, oh, well, that's good. And, shook my hand.
Awesome. So one of the things that I've just been super curious about is, I myself have been writing from a young age, but the amount and the intensity of the world building that you do within the Inheritance Cycle books. What is that process? Do you sit down and just make a list of characters and go from there? Or, there's just so much to that world. Where do you start with that?
Good question. Well, first you need a reason to do it, And the reason is usually the impetus for telling the story. Everyone has a different reason for writing a book. For me, it tends to come from an image that is coupled with a feeling. So I get an emotion coupled with an image. Usually maybe there's a sense of an event happening in that image, like finding a dragon egg or whatever else. But that in and of itself is not a story. That's a singular event. And if you try to write based off that alone, you're not going to have a book. And I tried that. I would try writing books based off these ideas I had, and they never went anywhere. And for me, the breakthrough was realizing that stories had structure, that structure could be studied and understood to a degree, and that you could consciously devise the structure and think of it as the skeleton that you were going to hang everything else on, the framework for your building. And once I really focused on that and thought about and looked at movies, looked at books, read books on how structure worked, that's what allowed me to create Aragon. And then the world building itself, it's all sort of part and parcel. Some of the things you create are created out of necessity. You think, okay, So my characters are traveling to a new location. Who could they encounter who would be interesting? Who do they need to encounter for the story? So that necessity drives who you create. But on the flip side, you can also have preconceived ideas that you want to work into the story, and then you find a way to do that also. I think a lot of it just comes from asking yourself questions about questions about what you want. Okay, my brain's moving faster than my mouth. You know what you're generally trying to write about. Let's say it's dragons. And then it's just sitting and being obsessive, and I'm serious, being obsessive about how would this work? What do I want to talk about? What makes sense to me? And as soon as you make your first assumption, then working out the consequences in excruciating detail in your head or on the paper. You don't have to share it all with your reader, but by doing that, that's what creates the reality and what makes it feel real, not just to you, but to the characters and the readers. And that's a lot of fun. It can also be frustrating because you also just want to tell the story, right? So it's this constant tension between, have I done enough world building work to write the story, or am I going to get into trouble or am I just wasting time now and procrastinating? For me, I'd say having done too much and not enough on different projects, I've learned that for me, too much is when I'm just avoiding writing, right? But not enough is when, if I can't sit down and tell you the story over a campfire, for example, or over a drink at a bar or something, if I can't verbally tell you the story and make it interesting and emotionally moving, then I don't understand it. And if you're trying to write stories, then the same is true for you. Not that you have to be a performer, but you have to understand your story well enough to actually be able to tell it. And if you've got it, if you can verbally tell it, you have a story. So for me, that means thinking about each of the characters and who they are and what they want and what's going to get them, how they change over the course of the story and how it all fits together. And ultimately, at a deep, deep level, what is the story about? I'm going to diss the new Star Wars movies for a second. I hope you bear with me. Now, I am a Star Wars fan, but I think one of the issues with the two new Star Wars movies is, and especially the latest one, emotionally, it's very difficult to get a sense of the emotional journey that these characters are going on, because there are so many different people who've been writing these movies and involved in making them. It seems like no one's in charge of the larger picture. When you think of the original films, you knew what Luke's story was from the very beginning, right? From his emotional journey, you had a real good sense of what that was. Same thing for Harry Potter. And when you lose that in a story, it gets very muddled. You might have wonderful things in your story, wonderful world building, wonderful writing, wonderful characters, but if you lose that core sense of what is this about, you lose your audience in a lot of ways. I'm sure many of you have heard of the original Blade Runner movie, right? And it's considered a cult classic. Now, why is it considered a cult classic and not a classic classic? Well, it's because from a structural standpoint, it switches protagonists 3/4 of the way through the movie. It switches from Harrison Ford to the replicant, I forget his name, played by Rutger Hauer, okay? He structurally becomes the hero of the story by the end. And so as the viewer, it's like there's a missing step. It doesn't mean the movie's bad. It just means it's confounding expectations, and as a result, it's never going to be that fulfilling of a story for the majority of people, right? Again, doesn't mean it's a bad story, it's doing something different. So for me, storytelling is really about trying to hone in on any book I'm doing, any story, and thinking, what is this about? And if I understand that, then I can write it. And if I don't, I struggle.
Very cool. So something that I like to ask writers a lot is...
Told you I like to talk.
So obviously there's influences as far as mythology and things like that from other fantasy and sci-fi stories and things that you've read. But when it comes to the actual characters that are in your book, are you drawing from experiences and people that you've met throughout your life? For instance, the character of Aragon, it kind of goes through a journey himself, and it's this kind of coming-of-age story. And you yourself were 17 when you started this, and as you're writing it, you're coming of age yourself.
Yeah.
Is there any kind of connection with that?
Definitely. The easiest thing for a teenage boy to write about is a teenage boy. The hardest thing for a teenage boy to write about is a 120-year-old elven female princess. And in this day and age, I do feel like I have to specify female princess. I definitely I mean, I use parts of all the people I know in the characters, and I use parts of myself. I have met some writers who do not emotionally relate to other people. They're still successful writers, but they often have to construct their characters almost like a Vulcan would, in a very logical, processed manner. They're able to tell good stories, but their writing never evokes deep passion. It has other joys in their writing. You know, you might enjoy the prose, you might enjoy the logic, you might enjoy all sorts of other things, but you don't really feel that these people are alive in the way you might with a different writer. So I do feel that that's important. I mean, not that you want to copy the people in your life or yourself necessarily, but you can take parts. You know, it's like
Everybody's got a Brahm in their life.
everyone's got a problem in their life, or they should, or they should. You know, or something. You know, it can be as small as the way someone picks up a cup that tells you something about them, a little motion, and then you can extrapolate. You know, writing is about taking, and art in general is about, it's not about copying reality, it's about heightening reality, reinterpreting reality, and that gives you so much freedom. You know, when you can write anything you want in sci-fi, fantasy, or sci-fi or fantasy. Conversely, it tends to show the limits of our imagination. When anything is possible, and yet we still write about the same things over and over. And yet that's not a bad thing. Sometimes writing about dragons is a good thing, you know, and magic swords and battles and all sorts of this fun stuff.
Mm-hmm. Game of Thrones has proven that.
Well, I'm not trying to call it fun, but...
Is there a point in like your writing process, whether that's the design phase, the coming to the end of the book phase, that is the most enjoyable for you?
Yes. I mean, the world building is a lot of fun because you're not actually writing at that point. Writing the first chapter or so is actually like the first part of every book is both terrifying and exciting and wonderful at the same time. Terrifying because you're having to nail down the tone of the book, but exciting because it's the beginning and you're getting to do it and it's wonderful. And then the ending. At least for me, the endings are usually why I'm writing a story. You know, that emotional payoff. If you've ever had the experience of watching a movie that you really connected with, and at the very end of the movie, something happens, and it just makes everything click into place in your brain, and emotions, and the character changes, and you get like a tingle up your spine, and the music swells. That's what I'm trying to get in a book. You know, that's what and I've had the experience with books also, and that is what I love, because that's what I love as a reader. And so if I can replicate that as a writer, I consider the work a success.
So did you have the ending for the Inheritance series in mind at the beginning?
I did.
Wow, okay.
I did. Now, some things did change. I have to be honest about that. Some things did change because my understanding of the characters changed over the 10-some years I was working on the series. So, I don't necessarily want to spoil something for someone who hasn't finished the fourth book, but there were a couple of characters. There was one character I killed who I wasn't planning on killing. There was another character I was planning on killing and I didn't kill. But the actual very ending never changed.
Something that I've heard a lot of writers talk about is when they begin on a project, generally they know how they want the story to start, they know how they want the story to end, but then as they're writing kind of the middle of that story, it's kind of a journey that they're going on themselves as they kind of fill in the gaps between that beginning and that ending. Would you say that's true for you as well?
No, and that's why they usually struggle writing the middle. By the way, you guys can't see it, but he's got a tattoo of a semicolon on his hand, which is like the most badass author tattoo I've ever seen. No, here's the problem with that. Okay, so traditionally authors get divided into two categories. You get pantsers, they make up the story by the seat of their pants, and there are plotters who plot everything out before they write it. Now, I'm much more in the plotting side, because I've tried pantsing. I can't do it.
It's pretty simple. You just unbutton and then...
we'll need some music up here for that. And here's the thing, is I've met a lot of authors who started as pantsers and become plotters. Because if you start making everything as a pantser, that only works if you're able to write a very quick first draft and you're okay psychologically with writing a bunch of drafts to keep revising it to get it to where it needs to go. There are some authors who do that and are okay, but it's a lot of work. Especially if you're creating an imaginary land that has to be self-consistent, especially if your book is over 100,000 words, especially if it's over 200,000 words, if it's over 300,000 words, you are not doing this, okay? At least you shouldn't be. Plotting sometimes can take away the spontaneity in a story, but not that much, because you still leave yourself open for creating something off the seat of your pants when you're writing within this overall framework. If you have your overall framework, you don't get that middle of the story slump, because you know what every single scene is doing to move the story forward. I've become increasingly enamored with a phrase that I always teach to people when I'm talking about writing, which is informational density. Not meaning that you overload people with tons of detail, even though I do that at times in my own books, but you're not just trying to tell useless detail. It's that everything should mean something, right? A good book, every sentence, even every word, pushes you forward in your understanding of the world, the character, and the events. And if you can do that, even, especially with the scenes, and you have that all in your mind beforehand, there's no slump, there's no slowing of the story. Yes, there are quieter moments, and there are faster moments, and there are more intense moments, and there are softer moments. But just like music that rises and falls and quickens and slows, it's that variation that still holds your interest and pulls you through. And yes, I do like talking about writing.
I want to build off of that a little bit. Do you think, so I am in a community of writers, and I know lots of writers that have written a first project, and they get that out, and then they're like, all right, I don't really know where to go from here. And I myself am kind of a plotter as well. And so for me, moving to, for instance, with my comic, moving to the second issue, I knew exactly what I wanted to do. Do you think that having that plotting style allows you to be more successful in lightning striking twice? And being able to kind of, so when you finish the first Aragon novel, and you decide, all right, I'm gonna start on book number 2, I mean, do you know when Aragon ends and the second book starts, you know exactly where you're starting with that?
Yeah, I mean, that's partly because the inheritance cycle is not really 4 books. It's just one giant book that's too big to publish in one volume. And actually, that was both enormous help for me, because it avoided your sophomore blues, in a sense, because it was all one piece. But it was also bad, on the other hand, because I got out of practice with plotting and other things. And I really noticed that when I started working on projects after the inheritance cycle. I had to relearn some of the skills that I learned prior to Aragon, or working on Aragon. I had to relearn it. I had to relearn it the hard way by writing a book that didn't work, and then having to fix it. And remind myself of all those hard lessons of, oh yeah, you got to do this work, you got to do this character work, you got to do this, you got to do that. You're not such a genius that you can just pull it out of thin air and make it work.
Awesome. Well, Christopher, you're here for them, so I'd like to now, there's a microphone right over here. If anybody has any questions, you guys feel free to make a little line over there. We'd love to take some audience questions. Sure can.
Okay. I just really want to know why you made the dwarf, when you made the king. You know what I'm talking about, right?
I do.
Why was that so long? I feel like it lasted forever.
So the question is, in the third book, I assume, yes, in Brissinger, which, by the way, when Brissinger came out, my agent called me and he said, congratulations, Christopher. You've proven you can have a #1 New York Times bestselling book where no one knows how to either say or spell the title of the book. Why was the coronation of the Dwarf King in the third book so long? I don't know. It felt appropriate. My editor didn't chop it out. If I were to go back and write it now, I might write it shorter. But with each book, I was trying different things, and some of those experiments were more successful than others. It was a learning experience. Sometimes that experiments were with pacing, sometimes it was character, sometimes it was language. So honestly, I've not reread Brissinger since I published the darn thing. So, but I am very proud of the book, and I do stand by it.
I'm not really sure how to ask this, and give it away in case anyone hasn't finished the fourth book, but that final battle between Aragon and Galbatorix, like how, there's just so much build up to that, and I just remember like wondering how in the world that it was gonna end. Trying to figure out a way to like
Plug
not
your
give
ears if
anything
you
away.
haven't read this part of the book yet.
And you wrote it in a way that makes it seem like the person that won is gonna lose. And the way that you went about it, to have the person that won win in that way, was just so complex and so out of left field. And I don't know, like, how did you come up with such an interesting result to such a epic battle that all 4 books led up to?
Oh, thank you. I love that question. So the question is that final confrontation, of course, that we build up to over the course of the 4 books. How did I actually plot that out and find the solution that I found? Sheer panic. Because what I did very consciously over the first 3 books, and then even into the fourth book, was do my very best to make it seem like Aragon is facing an impossible situation, right? Because, okay, he's gotten some supercharged elf powers, and he's got magic, and he's got a dragon, and it does you no good. It still does you no good. And I kept working this, making these obstacles ever greater for this confrontation. And what I didn't want to do was one more sword fight. Because I wrote so many sword fights over the course of that series, right? And I'm rather proud of some of them. But they just weren't right for that sort of a confrontation at the end. They weren't. And so I knew I wanted to do something else. And given my rules of magic, I was constantly thinking, okay, I'm going to need to do something unique here. Try to lay the groundwork. Try to find it. Try to do something that ties into all the themes of what Aragon is learning and doing over the course of the series. And that's ultimately where it came from. So as soon as I decided it wasn't going to be a sword fight, it was like, okay, what could it possibly be? I go into more detail, but spoilers.
Hi.
Have you got a list? You've got a list there?
Oh, I actually do. I like 26 questions, but anyway, what I wanted to actually say is how I visualize Skeletor is Ganon from Ocarina of Time. I wanted to know if that was a slight draw from that, because the menacingness, the booming of the voice, everything.
I have a horrible confession to make. I've never played any of the Zelda games.
Can I get a high five?
And I'll tell you why, because I've never had any of the Nintendo systems, or ever. So,
I think we're the only 2 people in the room that haven't done that.
I mean, I know enough to know that Zelda's the princess and not Link, but
At least he's got that.
Actually, the inspiration for Galbatorix came from 2 rather odd places. One are some drawings by a great American artist called Arthur Rackham, who illustrated all these children's books and like Robin Hood and stuff. Arthur Rackham, and he did some illustrations for Wagner's Ring Cycle. You can Google these, and he has some drawings of Odin or Wotan. And they're very close to how I imagine Galbatorix. They're very grim and dark and has the close-cropped beard, and it's quite, it's good. And also, I mention this at every one of my panels, and probably someone who's here who's been to some of my other panels is sick of hearing this, but there's a great early fantasy novel pre-Tolkien called The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison. Now, I recommend this all the time. No one ever actually reads the darn thing, because it's written in faux Jacobean English. Okay? It took me 3 tries to read the thing, and I love fantasy enough to write a fantasy novel at 15 in my bedroom. Okay? It's an amazing, wonderful novel that is right up there with Lord of the Rings, but it is tough to read until you get used to the language. But the villain of the book is a king named Goris the 13th or Goris the 12th, something like that. And some of the feel of that character seeped into Galbatorix a bit also.
Okay.
So no Ganon, unfortunately.
Well, then, actually, second side question is, did Saphira and Aragon actually, hit space, or was it, in your mind, the highest atmosphere?
They were still technically in the atmosphere, but they were very close to, so in the 4th book, Aragon and Saphira get caught in a giant cumulonimbus, anvil cloud sort of thing, and they get swept way up and they see the curve of the Earth. Now you might think this is completely unrealistic. Well, I based it off an actual news story I read of a hang glider in China, I believe, who was visiting for the hang gliding. I think it was a woman who got caught in a giant thunderstorm and got sucked up so high she lost consciousness, and for some reason she got enough oxygen. She woke up at one point, saw the curvature of the Earth, and then was brought back down by the air, lost consciousness again, and then regained consciousness some distance above the ground and was able to land safely. And the reason we know that this is not just some wild story she made up is because she was wearing a GPS tracker the whole time. Yeah, so I read that story a number of years ago. I'm sure you could find it with some digging on Google, and I was like, well, I have to use this.
Well, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
May the stars watch over you.
And you as well.
I have two questions.
I might have two answers.
They're kind of leaning towards the future books. One, we all thought the fourth book was the ending. You kind of led us to believe the fourth book was the ending. What led you to start a fifth or keep going with the story? I know the fourth one left us with a lot of questions
Yes.
for a lot of characters.
Well, okay, so just to be very clear, the inheritance cycle is finished. That story is finished. The story of Galbatorix and Aragon and Saphira is finished, okay? Future books within the series should not be, future books within the world should not be viewed as a direct continuation of the series. They are in the world, the same characters, some of the same characters are appearing, but they're telling a different kind of story or different stories. That story itself is finished. As for why I wanted to do it, well, I mean, I spent well over a decade of my life working on this world and this story and these characters. That's not, I mean, even if I live to be 100, I mean, that's a tenth of my life. And there's a lot of my childhood years that I can't really count as being that productive. So, you know, it's a huge chunk of my life. And, I mean, when I hit 30, I'd spent almost half my life working on this. So, I didn't want to just completely abandon it. So starting in Brissinger, I laid the groundwork for a couple of things that are going to be the foundation for future stories. Still plan on doing a massive book 5. This new book that is coming out is not book 5. It's just it's an hors d'oeuvre. It's an extra morsel, which I think you will enjoy. And I have other side stories like that, but book 5 is still a massive one that's going to be coming out later on.
So going along with that, the book that's coming out December 31st, will we get an updated map with that book?
Ooh, okay, so I'm so glad you asked this. So, Barnes & Noble, there's some things I can't tell you yet, so keep an eye on my social media. I'm not done with surprises this year. But, Barnes & Noble is releasing a collector's edition of Aragon, along with The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. And the collector's edition of Aragon has just shy of 50 extra pages of material. There are deleted scenes from Murtag's point of view when Aragon was captured in the town of Gilead. There's all sorts of art I've done for this series. There's stuff on the languages, on the names, on the world building. And there is a full-color painted map of Alagasia that I personally oversaw in that book. I don't know if they're doing it as a poster or just printed in the end papers or something, but it looks gorgeous. In The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, I can't even say the title. In The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, and by the way, that is worm like, that means dragon. That's, you know, you're fantasy fans, I don't need to tell you, but some people, I gotta say, there is a new map of lands outside Alagasia, and it is full color. And I did 3 other additional pieces of art for that book. Full page pieces of art, each one separating a section of the book. So, yes. Thank you.
So one of my favorite scenes from the book is the campfire scene between Aragon and Arya.
That's one of my favorites too.
So I should have been taught that references that you hit in there. Is that one of those 5 season moments that you were mentioning that you just had to slip that in there?
Yes, for those who aren't familiar, I slipped in some Doctor Who references in the series. To the point where the Doctor Who folks approached me about writing a Doctor Who book on more than one occasion, which was very flattering, but I had to say no because my own work will never get finished otherwise. But yes, those were some deliberate references.
So, as an author, what authors do you read that kind of humble you? For example, I'm a very, very, very amateur writer, but when I read like Brent Weeks, Brandon Sanderson, Patrick Rothfuss, or like Scott Lynch, it kind of makes me reevaluate what I'm doing and like think, well, these guys are so great. What am I doing? And kind of measure up to that. So, what kind of authors do you read that kind of just put you back on your heels?
Well, it depends what I'm reading an author for, because some authors will blow me away with their characters, others might blow me away with their language, or some cool thing they did in their world building. I'd say Frank Herbert with Dune, Ursula K. Le Guin with the Earthsea trilogy, The Worm Ouroboros by E.R. Edison, Tolkien, of course, the Mabinogion Tetralogy by Evangeline Walton. I would put her right up with Tolkien in terms of quality of her writing. The only reason her books are not as well known is because it's a retelling of Welsh mythology. It's more fractured in terms of the structure. It's not as cohesive, and as a result, it doesn't quite have the same appeal, but her writing is amazing. Smilla's Sense of Snow by Peter Hoag captures an amazing sense of what it is to be outside of the norm in society. It's a good movie adaptation also. I mean, Tolstoy, Dickens, a lot of the classics. The Book of the Dun Cow by Walter Wangerin Jr. There are a lot of authors out there that humble me all the time. I mean, anytime I see a beautiful sentence or a moving scene or something, I go, wow, I hope I can write something like that. I feel so limited as an author. But having talked with a lot of authors, I think that's a very common feeling. We all feel limited. And it's kind of unfair in a sense that as a new author, or even as an accomplished author, you get compared to the best who have ever lived. You don't get compared to the other kid who's writing a dragon story. You get compared to Tolkien. It's like, the dude had 35 years of experience on me and was a linguistics professor at Oxford. I mean, come on! Come on! So, and that's not to say that you shouldn't compare yourself against the best, because you should, but it can certainly be a little discouraging at times, but it's discouraging for everyone. And the thing is I can't write like Stephen King, but Stephen King can't write like me. I can't write like Robin Hobb or George R. Martin or any of these, and the reverse is true as well. So it goes both ways.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I just want to build off that real quick. Would you say that in that situation where you read something and you're like, oh my goodness, like this is just so above me, do you think the moments that make successful writers is they take those feelings and then they turn that into motivation to be better?
Sure. But it doesn't even have to be looking at someone else you consider bettering yourself. It ultimately just has to be the desire to better yourself. You have to simultaneously believe two things as a writer. While you're working on something, you have to believe that you are writing the greatest piece of prose fiction in the history of humanity, and everyone is going to bow down before you because of it. And then as soon as you finish, you have to look at it and say, this is the worst piece of thing ever written. How can I make it better? And if you can bring yourself to peace with the knowledge that you're going to fail, you're going to make mistakes. We all do, It's inevitable. There is no way around it. And that's okay. That doesn't make you a bad person. It doesn't even mean you're a bad writer or whatever you're doing in your life. Just because you made a mistake doesn't make you bad at what you're doing, because it's part of the process. We all do it. If you pick up Stephen King's book On Writing, which is called On Writing, at the back of it, he has a section of editing on one of his stories where he shows the actual edits he's making on his stories and the things he's changing, and they're being ripped out and added and stuff. And you might look at it and look at the amount of changes he's making, and if someone were to edit your writing like that, you might sit there thinking, I'm a horrible writer. Look at all these things they're telling me to fix. But that's part of the process. You don't get it right the first time. No one does. No one does. You get better as you get older and more experienced. I mean, before you lose your mind. But you never are going to get it right 100%. And so it's just part of the process.
Every writer has unfinished stories at home. How many do you have?
Remember those bookcases his dad had?
Well, prior to Aragon, I had a number of books I tried writing, but they never got past 5 or 6 pages of length, okay? Because I wasn't plotting my stories out. Aragon is the first full-length book I ever wrote. That wasn't me. But the first draft of Aragon, you probably wouldn't recognize too much. As I've said elsewhere, in the first draft of Aragon, Aragon wasn't named Aragon. He was named Kevin. That's right. Fortunately, I did change that eventually. There was also a unicorn in the book.
You don't think a book named Kevin would have sold?
No, but they did do... The books were so popular in Italy that they did 2 spoof books, a spoof of Aragon and a spoof of Eldest, and it was about, the main character was Aragon's rather stupider cousin named Aerosol, and he rides a giant purple turkey, and all of the Elvish lyrics and stuff are translated versions of Raindrops Are Falling on My Head and things like that. So, and the author has like the most Italian name ever. The author's name is Joey Luke Bandini. Yeah, that was an experience. Sorry, what was the question?
How many unfinished?
Oh, yeah. So prior to Aragon, basically nothing. Since I finished Inheritance, I wrote a screenplay that didn't work. I wrote a short novel that didn't work. I wrote a handful of fairly long short stories that didn't work. I wrote a first draft of a very long science fiction novel that didn't work. I wrote a second very long draft of a science fiction novel that didn't work. It was 285,000 words long, and it didn't work. Now, I could have given up. I could have said, I can't do this. But I didn't. And I know why those things didn't work. With each one, I was jumping into them without doing the footwork that I needed to do, which is what I was talking about earlier. So with my sci-fi novels I've been revising, I've been actually printing out each chapter and giving it to my early readers and saying, am I screwing up? Or am I on track? And each chapter they're saying, it's good, it works. Because this time, I did my homework. And of course, then the new book that's coming out, The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, all of those were, once I really remembered to focus on what is the story about. I wrote those short stories, I wrote the framing devices, I pulled it together. My sister wrote her short story that's in there as well. It all works. Even the first drafts, it worked. So yeah, I have a decent amount of material, and I may be able to rework some of it for publication down the road. I'm actually hoping there's going to be a sort of a avalanche of Paolini material appearing in the next year and a half. Thank you. That's what my agent's doing too.
Could you say something in Dwarvish for my aunt? She's never heard you do it before, so.
I'm so glad you asked. So I created a number of languages for the Inheritance Cycle, as you may know. The main language, of course, is the ancient language, which I based partially off of Old Norse, since it has a wonderful, I thought it had an interesting sound, okay? The first word was Brissinger. That was the first one I came up with that I needed, and it's an Old Norse word. So I used that as the basis for the rest of the language. So I'll give you a phrase in the ancient language first. Now, unfortunately, I have a horrendous Elvish accent, and that's because in the ancient language, you are supposed to roll your R's on the tip of your tongue the way you would in Spanish or Italian. And I can't do that. The only way I can roll my R's is by wiggling my uvula. That's the little thing that hangs in the back of your throat. I'm going to give you the Elvish blessing that appears in the second book. And I'm going to wiggle my uvula at you guys. And I hope you like it too.
This is getting hot.
Atra sterni ono velduen, undueverinja ono varda. Mariner lifa uninharta owner. I messed that up. Because I don't have the book in front. That's what jet lag does you. Atra duever. Give me Eldest. Someone give me Eldest here. My flight landed at 12:45 last night. And this is not my time zone, so Normally I can do this off the top of my head, but my brain is no longer working. 1 second. There we go. 673. Here we go. Atra sterni onothelduin, ranulifun unin harte onder, undu everinia onovarda. So there's a lilt to it. But the dwarf language, which is what you asked about, I created from scratch, and it has a great sound and feel. You can just sink your teeth into it. So here's one of the dwarves being all angry and complaining about Aragon and Saphira being in the dwarf mountains. And unlike the ancient language, I have an excellent dwarvish accent. Because in the dwarf language, you are supposed to roll your R's by wiggling your uvula. So, let the wiggling commence. Thorn Rathkarach, Thorn Jürgen Karmiter, Nos Etagoroth Bastarnog, Dur Incesti Rakithen, Gok Iswarv Aj Barzuligor, Dur Durgeinst Aj Schwalden Rak Anuin, Bog Tor Rak Jürgen Fran. Thank you. So as you can tell, the dwarves are usually very hoarse, and no one much likes listening to their love poems.
Well, I was going to ask a question about the upcoming book, but seeing as how it would either spoil or
Ask.
All right. Will it have books following after it, much like Aragon had, following books come after that, or is it going to be a standalone collection?
Well, the full title, it's actually on the cover of this book, is The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm, Tales from Allegasia, Volume 1, Aragon. So, yes.
Fair enough. And if I could do one more question.
You may.
Potentially spoilers for anybody who hasn't read the last book. Aragon is able to succeed in the end by the use of a very specific name in the ancient language. Was that an original plan of yours from the beginning, or was that as you were putting it, a moment of tangent by you?
Actually, technically, he doesn't succeed through that name. He succeeds through magic without words. But the name plays a very important role in allowing him to do that, as it's used by Murtagh. And yes, that was always the plan, because my magic works off of the concept of true names, being the power, giving you power over objects and things and energy. And of course, if true names are powerful, then there must be a name of names. And that would be the most powerful name of all. And I'm never going to share that with you guys, because, you all seem like lovely people, but I don't trust you that much. Good question. Hi.
Hello. So you kind of answered my question about the languages. I did kind of hear that the Dwarven language sort of sounded like mock German.
I had someone tell me it sounds like Hungarian for some reason, but I haven't listened to any Hungarian, so I'll have to look it up. I do like German.
But I also have another, my actual question now. Have you read Terry Brooks's books?
I've read some of them. I read 3 or 4 of the sort of, he doesn't say it as Shannara. He says
Shannara?
Shannara.
Yeah. I say Shannara, he says Shannara. Yeah. I read 3 of them, 3 or 4 of them back in the day, but I really enjoyed the Magic series of Landover. I think that was my favorite of his books I've read.
That's why I was I wonder if he's read the Landover book.
Yeah, definitely. So, and he is a lovely man. Terry Brooks, he was on my first panel at my first convention, which is San Diego Comicon. I was 19, and he took me under his wing. He gave me great advice. He has been a wonderful friend over the years, as he has been to many other authors. He is a good person. He really is. He's one of the good guys.
Yeah, I just got his recent book, and I'm really excited to read it.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it also.
So this question is related to you saying that you were a plotter. Did you have the same editor throughout the entirety of the inheritance cycle? And how did they impact and change? How did she, he, they impact and change the actual story beyond the prose and the grammar?
So my editor's name is Michelle Fry. She's at Random House Knopf. And I had the her all the way through the inheritance cycle, and she edited the new book that's coming out. And she is my editor. And here's why. Not only is she a great editor, but when the book was first referred to Random House by Carl Hyacin, who wrote the young adult book Hoot, some of you may have heard of that. He also wrote Striptease, some of you may have heard of that. But he recommended the self-published version of Aragon to Random House, and it bounced around from editor to editor till it came up to Michelle, and Michelle likes fantasy, and she was the one who went to bat for it in a corporate meeting at Random House and said, I want to take a chance on this giant series written by a teenager. So yeah, she's my editor. As far as how she shaped the story, she was really good in helping me write a better version of Arya. Because again, I was not a 120-year-old elven princess writing this book. And I struggled with that sometimes because the book is written so strongly from Aragon's point of view, or the books, for the most part, that I would fall in the trap of sometimes seeing Arya or the other characters only the way Aragon sees them. And when that involves a very beautiful woman that he has a crush on, and more than a crush, it can get a little one-sided. And so Michelle was very good because she'd sort of rap me on the knuckles sometimes and say, you know, you need to remember to look at this from Arya's point of view. You need to look at this a different way. And that was probably the biggest change to the story, was maybe some of the Aragon-Arya interactions. But everything else stayed pretty much the same. And of course, pacing and prose and all the other things that an editor helps with were obviously there also.
Okay, and I can imagine that as a 15-year-old kid, you've never really had serious editing before, so she probably had a lot of changes to make. How did she encourage you?
Well, actually, I got a ton of editing from my parents before we self-published, so I'd already had some of that experience. The difficult part was not that I was not used to heavy editing, it was that I had been thinking of the book as done when we self-published it. You know, it was done for a year as we were selling it and marketing it and all of that, and then it got picked up by Random House. It's like, oh, we need to go through the editing process again. And it was rough because the edited manuscript showed up the day before Christmas. Now, what this means is my editor was out on holidays from Christmas through New Year. So there was like 2 weeks or a week and a half where I couldn't talk to her. And I had this giant manuscript with all these marks. I didn't know how the process worked. I was freaking out. I was like, do I have to accept everything? Is this like the word of God from her? Or can I argue? Can I suggest alternate changes? What do I do? She felt bad enough about sending that on the day before Christmas. She sent me a leather-bound, suede, red, leather-bound notebook with the manuscript as an apology. I like my editor. So, encouragement, I would just call her up and say, help, and she would give me the author pep talk, and then it was all good. Author pep talks, by the way, are sold in bulk in the publishing industry. Agents buy the most of them.
When writing your fighting scenes, have you ever acted any parts of them out to make sure they work? Because when I do that at home, people think I'm crazy, and I just have to keep telling them that I'm writing.
Look, I make a career listening to the voices in my head, so yeah, totally. I think having a very clear idea of what is happening physically in a fight is important. You don't have to necessarily describe it in a very technical way so that like you were writing a martial arts manual or something, but for you as the writer, yeah, it's good to know what's happening. I do that all the time. Now, I'm really good with visualization. I have, if you've ever seen like these three-dimensional wooden puzzles that fit together to form like cubes and things like that, so I have one that looks like two pyramids stuck together base to base, so it's kind of like a diamond shape like this. 51 pieces. I can take it apart and put it together blindfolded. So, visualization is just like my main strength. So I don't usually act it out physically because I'm doing it in my head, but I have sometimes sculpted things that I needed help with describing. You know, like a little, like the inside of the Tronchim, you know, with the spiral staircase and all these galleries and arcades that were difficult to describe. I actually sketched it out and did a little sculpting, and that helped me. So yeah, whatever works. If it helps you, use it. It's not a cheat. And you're not crazy much. I mean, you want to be a writer, so you're a little crazy. Like all of us.
All writers are pretty crazy. I think you have to be,
Yes. By the way, fair warning, if any of you want to write fantasy, at a certain point you will grow a beard. And I've talked with Robin Hobb, and she says this happens to women too.
Okay, so I had two questions, and they're pretty general. But the first one is, I wondered what your thoughts on the term aspiring writer is.
I have neither positive nor negative connotations with that. I think it's a neutral term. I think I never told people I was writing a book when I was writing my first book, because then people expect something from you, or they judge you, or just, it's like, it's not real until it exists, until I finished writing it. So only people who knew I was writing were my parents, basically, So I kept it very to myself, because that way it took the pressure off. And also, there's actually psychological studies that show that if you tell people you're going to do something, you sometimes get the same psychological payoff as actually doing it. Oh yeah, I'm going to donate money to the animal shelter. Oh yeah, I'm going to write a book. Well, sometimes that takes the wind out of your sails to talk about that like that. So that's sometimes why I don't talk about my projects on Twitter. It's like, well, what are you working on? Oh, I'm working. What are you doing? When's something coming out? You'll find out. And then, ta-da, it's done. Because otherwise there's this real sense of, I don't know, strain or pressure. But as far as the phrase itself, nothing wrong with it. But if you really, 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 really want to be an author yourself, maybe just say, I'm a writer. I'm a writer. I'm not published yet, but I'm a writer.
Yeah, I mean, I call myself a writer. I've never called myself an aspiring writer.
Mind you, I didn't think I was an actual author until my third book got published. Because, the first book might be a fluke. Even the second book might be a fluke. You get 3 books published, okay, I think I can call myself a writer now.
I would hope so at that point, geez. My second question was, being homeschooled, do you think that affected your creativity in a positive way, or do you think going through the school system it would have been the same?
Well, I don't know, because I didn't go through the school system. My mom's a trained Montessori teacher, and I think that was a wonderful help for me. In a strictly logistical sense, the greatest benefit from homeschooling is that I was able to graduate at 15, because I never took any summer breaks. Thank you, Mom. And I think it would have been very difficult to write a book like Aragon at 15, 16, 17 if I had to go to school every day. I just wouldn't have had the time. I had to do so much learning and so much work. It was a full-time job, okay? I think maybe the biggest benefit from the homeschooling outside of that would be that it allowed me to pursue my interests however I wanted. And I just never had the experience of getting made fun of for my interests or for who I was. That's one thing I love about these conventions. Everyone here is passionate about something. You're passionate about anime, or you're passionate about fantasy, or you're passionate about whatever it is, you're here because you're a fan of something. And no one's making fun of you. Fans have taken over the world, really. The nerds have taken over the world. And that's why these conventions, to me, are a very positive experience. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
You are
I
so
really
welcome.
appreciate you being here.
How are we doing on time?
So we have about 2 minutes left. I hate to do this. Since you've already asked a question, I'm going to go ahead and let the person behind you ask one. So we've got time for one more quick question.
But do feel free to come up and ask me a question after.
Absolutely. What booth number are you?
Oh, I'm done after this.
Are you? Okay.
I'm done after this.
First of all, I want to say thank you for the revelation that panthers can become plotters, because I've been freaking out about that, personally. Secondly, you talk about story a lot in musical terms, and I'm just curious if if you have any musical background, if you sing or play something, or just it's an interest, or do you have any playlists that you recommend?
I play the recorder. I love music. I listen to music when I write. I don't really have any playlists I would recommend. I do listen to a lot of movie soundtracks when writing, which I find helpful, pairing the appropriate sound with the appropriate scene. I do think that most great writers have a musical sense in their language. Patrick Rothfuss is a great example. He's got a musical sense to his prose. That's, plotting and the plot and characters are something else entirely. I'm just talking about sentence level here. Ursula Le Guin has a musical sense to her language. Tolkien does also. You can train that. You know, there is a book called Shakespeare's Metrical Art. It is the best book I've ever read on, you know, prose, verse, poetry and stuff, and I learned a lot from it. So, yeah, I do think of it in terms of music. I think of story in terms of beats and rhythms and tempo and volume, and that's all very helpful.
Excellent, thank you.
Christopher, thank you so much,
Yes,
everybody.
My pleasure. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for reading the books. I hope you read The Fork, the Witch, and the Worm. I hope you enjoy it. It is a wonderful little bonbon of a book. I'm very proud of it, and I hope you enjoy the sci-fi book when it comes out as well. And as Aragon himself would say, Sioner Sverdar Sitya Havas. May your swords stay sharp. Thank you.